But because of the large numbers involved and the long replacement time, MiG-21s remained in service for another 15 years. Only about 150 of the original model were built. As the aircraft was supplied to the Air Force, it was continuously modernized, with several model updates introducing higher engine thrust or more sophisticated electronic equipment. Deficiencies in the first months of operational service led to the introduction of the MiG-23M, with a Tumansky engine producing 27,500 pounds of thrust. The nose cone had to be modified to house radar with a larger antenna, 26 inches in diameter. The weapons system was constantly evolving as missile technology became more sophisticated. Soviet pilots were used to the high landing and takeoff speeds of the MiG-21. The new variable geometry system of the MiG-23 offered much better handling qualities at low speeds. Given the complexity of the variable geometry system, the transition from straight to the swept wing positions was very smooth. The weapon system on the MiG-23 was a major advance on that of the MiG-21. It had to meet the demand of the Soviet Air Force for beyond visual range capability. A pair of Apex air-to-air missiles were guided by a Sapphire radar system with a detection range of 80 kilometers and a tracking range of 55 kilometers. Whereas Western designers at the time depended heavily on radar, the Soviet Air Force believed in supplementing radar with infrared guidance systems. They stood a better chance in air combat against increasingly sophisticated electronic countermeasures, and the best of both systems could be used to track the target. A normal weapon load would consist of one semi-active radar homing missile and one infrared missile. It would also contain 2 or 4 close-range dogfight missiles. Initially, these were copies of the American Sidewinder, but later they were replaced by a Soviet design with better performance. The MiG-23 also had a double-barreled 23mm cannon mounted under the center line of the fuselage. It was a formidable weapons package. A two-seater version, the MiG-23UM, was introduced to train new pilots. Visibility for the instructor in the rear cockpit was poor, so it was fitted with a simple periscope made of 2 mirrors. The UM was virtually identical with the standard single-seater, except that it had less electronic equipment. The dual control system allowed for the instructor to take over at any time. The controls in the rear cockpit would automatically override those of the student in the front. The instructor could also control the ejection of both seats. Unlike Western countries, most of which have 3 separate military services, the Soviet Union had 5. In these post-Soviet days, Russia maintains the same system. It has an army, a navy, an air force, and 2 others. One is the Strategic Missile Force, with intercontinental ballistic missiles, and a missile attack warning system. The other is the Air Defense Force, which combines ground surveillance and a radar detection network with surface-to-air missile units and fighter interceptor air wings. The MiG-23P was a dedicated air defense version which entered the service with the Air Defense Forces. The P stands for Перехватчик, meaning interceptor. Traditionally, the Soviet Air Force depended heavily on ground intercept control stations. The Air Defense Force has the same dependence on ground control. The ground stations transmit guidance commands directly to the onboard systems of the interceptor, steering it into position to lock its radar onto the target. The terrain of the former Soviet Union occupies 1/6 of all the land on the planet Earth. It extends over 11 time zones from east to west. It runs from the cold of the Arctic Ocean in the north to the hottest deserts of Central Asia. It is a vast area to defend. In the Air Force, tactical aviation, or frontal aviation as it has been called since the Great Patriotic War, is organized into air armies assigned to specific military districts. The Air Force of the Moscow Military District alone is responsible for an area that runs 600 miles from the border of Belarus in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east. Through the 1970s and into the 80s, the MiG-23 was the workhorse of Soviet military aviation, on standby to respond instantly for the Air Force and the Air Defense Force. There is a controversy about the radar that equipped the MiG-23. Western observers say that the technology copied from a Phantom F-4J shot down in the 60s allowed Soviet designers to develop a radar that could distinguish between a moving target and something else in the background, like clouds or Earth. But Soviet designers deny that they stole the idea and claim they developed it in parallel with the West. In any case, the development opened the way for the revolutionary look-down, shoot-down radar system. In the early 70s, when the MiG-23 began to be noticed by Western observers, they were not disturbed by it, considering it to be inferior to the new Western fighters in development at the time. But in 1974, when the oil crisis struck and Western economies suffered, it became clear that the MiG-23 had one great advantage. Even by Soviet standards, it was highly producible. As Western defense budgets were cut, MiG-23s continued to flow from the Soviet factories. The key to this ease of production was the continuing Soviet philosophy of simplicity of construction. To take advantage of the situation brought on by the oil crisis, MiG-23 production was accelerated to unprecedented levels. By this time, the first Western variable geometry fighter was entering service with the US Navy in increasing numbers. It was the Grumman F-14 Tomcat, designed to supersede the F-4 Phantom, and to be a major performance advance on the Soviet fighters of the time. In a way, the design brief for the F-14 was similar to that of the MiG-23. Both had to have a top speed in excess of Mach 2, and while the MiG-23 had to be able to take off from short, rough airfields, the Tomcat had to be catapulted from aircraft carrier decks. The Tomcat was bigger than the MiG-23. It had an unswept wingspan of 64 feet, compared with 47 feet in the MiG. It had a crew of 2. The MiG carried a pilot only. The Tomcat's wing sweep system was different. Its straight position was 16 degrees and fully swept 68 degrees. The MiG's 3 positions were manually selected by the pilot, but the F-14 sweep was controlled automatically by a sweep programmer that kept the wing at the best sweep angle for current flying conditions. The MiG-23 had 1 engine, and the F-14 had 2. The design of the MiG-23 was strongly influenced by the American F-111 fighter bomber, but in this aircraft, a Sukhoi Su-24, the F-111's influence is even more apparent. The Su-24 was the direct Soviet equivalent of the F-111. It was designed for the same mission, low-level penetration through enemy air defense systems, seeking targets well beyond the front line. The Soviets classified this aircraft as a frontal bomber, but NATO gave it the code name Fencer. The initial letter F in NATO code stands for fighter. NATO chose an F-code word for the Su-24 because its American counterpart, the F-111, is classified by its own country as a fighter. The Su-27 has 2 seats arranged side by side. The pilot sits in one and the weapons control officer sits in the other. External weapons have always been a problem for variable geometry aircraft. Fixed hard points under a movable wing move with the wing instead of pointing straight ahead. The Su-24 solves this problem by having swiveling pylons that remain parallel to the center line of the aircraft no matter how much the wing sweeps. There has always been great rivalry between the MiG and Sukhoi Design Bureau. By the 1960s, they were the only 2 Soviet designers of tactical combat aircraft. Their position at the top of the hierarchy is secure and is respected by the whole of the industry. Sukhoi's Su-17 and the MiG-23 have almost identical performance. But the Soviet Air Force would not rationalize the situation and stop production of one or the other for fear of offending its design bureau. There was a design study for an aircraft to be called the MiG-35. It would have been a direct competitor with the Sukhoi Su-24. It never went into production.